Hello, Daphne here with another video, this time about my dearly beloved father. My father's parents immigrated to the United States from Edinburgh, Scotland, and settled in Ventura, California. My father was a Californian through and through. He loved California. He graduated from the University of California at Berkeley and then from medical school at the University of California, Berkeley. After his graduation, he joined the Navy and was a naval officer doctor on the good ship Brooklyn, which traveled eastward to Shanghai and the port of Vladivostok. That port, Vladivostok, is the only port in Russia during the winter that's open because the rest of them are frozen over. My grandparents, believe it or not, lived in Vladivostok. They had opened an import-export business between the United States and Russia, and they were the only Americans living there at the time. So you can imagine that when Americans showed up on a naval ship, they invited them up to their house for afternoon tea or cocktails or whatever. That is where my grandparents and my mother met my father. My mother was 10. My father was 20 years her senior. My grandmother was a prolific letter writer, so she kept up with my father over the years. My mother went to college and graduated here in the United States, and then was headed back to Shanghai on a ship. And believe it or not, my father was on that same ship, and my grandmother knew that he was going to be on that ship. So she wrote my mother a letter and said that she was under strict orders not to be a pest and not to fawn all over this handsome doctor. Anyway, my mother paid no attention whatsoever to her mother's advice, and 1 year later my mother and father were married in Peking, China, and settled in Shanghai, where my father had a very, very successful medical practice, treating the likes of Shanghai Shek and other Chinese government notables. They lived a glamorous life. Shanghai in those days was sometimes referred to as the Paris of the East, and it was a glamorous, glamorous place. Black tie dinners. My mother lived the most incredible life in Shanghai, and they both loved it. My mother was a socialite, my father a beloved and respected doctor. They really had the world by the string. And so along comes little Daphne. But it wasn't long after that my father was thrown into a concentration camp by the Japanese. It was located on Haiphong Road, and it was a torture camp of the worst degree to my father. Not only was he undernourished and underfed, but he was denied medical supplies that could have helped save his fellow prisoners. I think this to my father was the worst torture of all. Anyway, my mother was also interned at Chapai concentration camp, which is now Shanghai Normal University. But very fortunately for my family, we were on exchange of prisoners between the United States and Japan. I guess we were chosen because, after all, I was a little baby at the time, and I don't think the Japanese wanted to be responsible for anything happening to families with small children. So that my parents boarded the good ship Gripsholm and sailed back to the United States, free at last from the Japanese. You can imagine the profound relief they felt as they made their voyage home. My mother said that when she walked for the first time on the soil under her feet in New York City, it was one of the happiest moments of her life. Both she and my father were so happy to finally be back home and away from away from Shanghai and the torturous Japanese. They moved back to California. My father set up a very successful medical practice outside of San Francisco, and he was a beloved all over again by his patients and everybody that knew him, including this daughter of his who worshipped the ground he walked on. Then one year my parents decided to go to the Rose Bowl game in Pasadena, California, because the University of California was playing against Northwestern that year. On the way, they stopped in Fresno. My father was a wonderful man. He always had a good sense of humor. He was so much fun to be with. My mother thought he was joking when he bumped up against a whole bunch of parking meters in Fresno where they had made a stop. But she realized there was something wrong. There was something going on. So she led him carefully to a drugstore, sat him down on a stack of newspapers, and called for help. Shortly, an ambulance arrived and took him to the hospital. 12 hours later, my father died of a massive stroke. I will never forget the day I was told that he was dead. It was a tragedy of enormous, enormous proportions, and one of the most awful, terrifying moments of my entire life. But, the story did have a happy ending in one way, because he has always been near and dear to me in my heart. I always have thought of him at important moments in my life, when I got married, when my 4 children were born, and other milestones. He was such a wonderful man, and to this day I can honestly say that when I think of him, my whole body and heart and soul lights up with pure joy. So I was very fortunate to have such a truly wonderful, devoted, loving father who I miss terribly. But who knows, maybe I'll see him one day if and when I arrive in heaven.